Check, test, test. All right, let's pause this. Get us going here.
Hello?
Check,
Can you
test.
hear me all right?
Yes, yes, I can hear you. Dr. Kaufman, can you hear me? Check, test. Dr. Kaufman, do you hear us?
I can
Check,
hear him.
test.
Just heard him.
Good, George, I've got you.
I think I got you now.
Okay, good. Check, test.
Yes, that's good.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. Dr. Kaufman, so excited to have you on. All right. Let's see. We'll go around real quick. I've got my team with me, Dr. Felipe, Professor Reply All George, and Vinny B. And we're all very excited to have you on. I want to say why, and then I don't want to give it away, and I don't want to say why. But let me go ahead and do it anyway, because I want to do basically a Barney style on medicine and the coronavirus, and then I want to jump to big picture. And I'm gonna go ahead and open my Christmas present now and explain why it was so important. George, mind your background noise. Mute until you're ready to come
on. Roger that.
Hello,
Dr. Kaufman. How are you doing, sir?
Hi, George. How are you?
Great yourself. So forgive me for saying this. When I told people I was going to be doing an interview with you today, they said, boy, I loved you on Taxi. I'm sure you've never heard that one before.
All right.
Yeah, it comes up.
Thank you. Now let me finish my introduction. Shut up. Mute for a second so I can finish my introduction. Freaking George. George is our comic interlude there. So the reason why it was so important to me to have you on is we are in the midst of a revolution, and the revolution includes nomenclature and even language. And the one of the most positive things that has come out of the coronavirus pandemic, and I'm broadcasting. I fully expect I'm broadcasting on one of my YouTube channels, and I fully expect this to be interrupted in the middle of it. So I'm going to go ahead and call it a scamdemic. Is that the most positive thing to come out of it is I was completely unaware of what it means, what medicine is, completely unaware of what medicine is, of who doctors are. And it was quite a revolutionary find for me to realize that what we rely on doctors for, they don't really do. And in fact, it's kind of the reverse. And so you're on the cusp. I would say you and Dr. Cowan, Dr. Morell, Dr. Lanka are riding the crest of this revolution. And I'm a veteran, as we talked about. And so I don't throw around words lightly. I don't throw around words like friend. I don't throw around words like hero. To me, a hero is defined as someone that does the right thing in the face of strong negative influences not to do the right thing. So not to embarrass you, but I would put you and Dr. Cowan, Dr. Morell, Dr. Lanka, and anybody else trying to say the word, trying to get the word out on this as heroic. You yourself have said, first, let me pause. I know my audience knows you very well, but let me go ahead and do a little bit, and you can flesh this in for me, of your background. Molecular biology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, computer modeling for drug design, worked for a CDC position in reporting AIDS cases. How awesome is that? Oh my goodness, that's pregnant as it gets. Physician's assistant, med school in Charleston, and then psychiatry and terminal patient counseling at Duke. So you're a blue devil. And then I think this is my favorite, forensic psychiatry, which is investigative, law enforcement, exposure to crimes and cults, and then you left academics and teaching because of finding evidence of corruption and insider favors. You want to flesh out your background for us? It's a fantastic resume.
Well, thank you, Johnny. And, hearing all that, it really seems like every piece of my background experience lends itself to uncovering the true nature of the pandemic. So, for example, when I worked in the CDC-sponsored position for the New York City Health Department, reporting AIDS cases, I got to learn firsthand exactly how this epidemiologic data gets reported, through the government agencies in a public health situation. And in the forensic training that I got, which is not just applied to criminal situations, but to any legal or administrative process that has to do with, when someone has a mental problem interfering with their fitness for duty on a job, like especially in safety sensitive positions like law enforcement. And, I've worked with people at local, state, and federal levels, and also with any kind of tort lawsuit, like harassment or damages or medical malpractice, psychological damages, even wrongful termination. All of these kinds of things can involve mental health issues. But the forensic work itself is really looking through a mountain of evidence often. And I've had cases with thousands of pages of records to go through. And then you have to sift out, the relevant pieces of information to make an important opinion. In that case, it's a medical legal opinion. But in this case, it's, figuring out what's really going on. And so all these pieces of experience seem to have kind of prepared me for this moment and what I've done over the last year, trying to study and figure out what's going on in the world related to this alleged virus.
So, Doctor, when we're sick, when somebody gets sick, it's ingrained in us that we go and we speak to a doctor, and it's fascinating that I had to look that up and find that the word doctor is based on of all languages Latin, and it comes from the Latin doceo, which means to instruct and or indoctrinate, and does not necessarily correlate with healing. And we go and we stand before someone in a white lab coat, and if they really want to impress us, they'll put a stethoscope around their neck and they'll hold a clipboard. And we'll give up our complaint. I've got a crick in my neck, and very often that doctor will say, "Okay, I've got a drug for that, and I'll write your prescription, and you're good to go." Versus something that might be considered more comprehensive healing, but is actually called alternative and holistic and pseudo medicine, something of that. And the real fact that, pardon me, the fact that we call this process medicine implies that there is a substance we need to take rather than an all-encompassing examination of our health, such as what's your diet, how are you sleeping, what's your stress level, are you married, are you single, are you happily married? All these things never get asked by people that we expect are going to heal us. And it's an absolute radical paradigm shift.
Johnny, even in the mainstream medicine, they actually acknowledge this to some degree. So there was this amazing research that came out several years ago, and I can't remember the exact name of it right now, but actually this doctor, who is a primary care doctor, was trying to find out, why his patients were sick, like especially with obesity. And he noticed in talking to his patients, which is, as you mentioned, something rarely done, that many of them had sexual trauma. And so he did research, and he actually asked people through surveys about their trauma experience in their childhood. And he found out that many of these chronic illnesses are actually highly associated with trauma, especially sexual trauma. And he went all over to academic departments of medicine and hospitals. Like I saw him give a grand rounds at the medical school I was on faculty at, talking about this research, and nothing was ever came of it. So in other words, we have this amazing finding that all this disease is actually associated with childhood trauma, not with high cholesterol, stressful job and, bad genes and germs. And yet medicine did absolutely nothing to try and address this to improve people's health. And so that's not really the goal of it, if you look at it carefully.
That's fantastic. You saved that for me. God bless you. That is awesome. My third book, Eaters of Children, dealt in child abuse and child sex slave trafficking. And I have found that a correlation for adults practicing homosexuality is there's usually, not usually, but often there is a childhood sexual trauma involved. And that I'm very suspicious of the trend not too long ago, towards the 80s and 90s, of looking for a genetic reason for homosexuality in a similar vein of exactly what you're saying, to cover up criminal enterprise, a criminal process of grooming and abusing children, usually by the elite, the kind of people that can spend money and erase evidence. So a fantastic point. Before I leave your bio, I've got some other points that I wanted to bring up. That the pharmaceutical industry and lobby is much more powerful than we give it credit for. And you were almost seduced yourself by a representative. They come in, they bring out their best, they're good-looking women and men, and they wine and dine. Medical students have tremendous debt, and drug companies basically hang baits out in front of you. Hey, behave in this way and we'll give you kickbacks and so forth. Which I guess that was a little bit of a wake-up call for you when you were going through your process.
Well, when I was young and naive, and, you're right, like you start out, you don't have much money, you could be in debt, and you have these charismatic young people usually, and they're often quite attractive, and they invite you out to dinner, free dinner at a fancy restaurant with cocktails and other events like this. They try to make it fun and they hook you in. And so I was participating in these things and having a good time. And then I was actually asked to do a talk. And this was when I was a physician assistant. And one of the drug reps asked if I would do a dinner talk about anemia of chronic disease. And he sold, of course, a drug that could be used in the treatment of that. But at that time, I thought, oh, well, this is great. They're going to pay me. They paid me like $750 to give a talk for a couple of hours. And I developed a slide deck and a presentation. And then like a couple of days before, the drug rep hands me a disc with the company slideshow. And he's like, oh, we would appreciate it if you use these slides, right? So I was like, oh, okay. No one's ever done my work for me before, right? So I open them up and take a look, and it's basically just marketing material. And so I'm like, I'm not going to use this. And of course, that was my wake-up call. And I was never invited to give another talk, although that one, in my mind, it went well. So, but, this is when I figured out that they're not really doing this out of, goodness to educate people. They actually have a very specific motivation, and they're trying to sell their product and use you as someone maybe who can speak well or has knowledge to essentially market or advertise their products for you. And it's very insidious. And in fact, when doctors are surveyed, they often say, no, I realize it probably influences other doctors, but not me, right? And that because we don't acknowledge things like that. But obviously the drug companies wouldn't spend the incredible budgets on this type of marketing if it weren't paying off for them in profits, right? They don't do business that way. If the money's not generating more revenue for them, then they do something different.
The power of manipulation is, I'm at a loss for words, and I would give the same moniker, the same adjective as I would for the coronavirus, the pandemic, of basically diabolical. The process of putting through, taking someone that wants to be a healer and turning them into a doctor is just absolutely shocking. And I know that there are some pretty good sources on it. Eustace Mullins wrote about it, although his overall conclusions I would disagree with. He stops short and blames a particular ethnicity for this issue, and I go further than that. This process dating back at least 150 years, maybe even 2 centuries. And the family name Rockefeller. George, please mute. And the name Rockefeller comes up often in relation to certifying. George, mute. He does this all the time.
He turned his video off. So he's
sorry. I'm sorry. I had to babysit my dogs because I have an inspector over in the main house. Sorry, I'll mute.
Yeah, just mute until you're ready to come in, pal. Thank you. Oh my goodness. That's your camera. Now your microphone. Here, let me do it for you. Undo it when you're ready to come in. Oh my word. Every time. Love a guy. The dear friend. Only George. George calls me like once or twice a day. Love him. So the name Rockefeller frequently comes up in taking people that want to be healers and demanding that they become certified and funneling them into a process. And the process is one of indoctrination and indebtedness. And this dawned on me when I realized that through listening to you and Dr. Cowan, that the vast majority of experts in microbiology and virology, we're not speaking from personal experience. We're not speaking from when they're giving their information. They're not giving information from having gone through the scientific method in the traditional sense. They're giving their information because they read it in a textbook. And when we deal with issues like isolating a virus, and Dr. Cowan is so good on this. Okay, so to a normal human being, when you talk about isolating something, I've got a pile of M&Ms, and they have a brand new white M&M. I'm going to go through this pile, and I'm going to isolate the white M&Ms, and I'm going to pick it out. I'm going to put it over here. And that has nothing to do with what they say about isolating a virus, does it?
No, that would be the common sense way that you do that, because, you know, if you took those white M&Ms and had them by themselves isolated, well, then you could examine them, right? You could open them up and say, you know, is there anything besides chocolate inside, right? Are they different from the other M&Ms? You could take bits of the shell, right, and then put it in a gas chromatograph and then analyze the chemicals in there that make it white, like maybe there's a white dye in there, right? Or maybe it's undyed. But you can't know that unless you have it. If you have the white ones mixed with the red ones and the green ones and the brown ones, how are you going to tell what's what? You won't be able to tell anything about the white ones because you'll be looking at the whole mixture. So that's really the crux of the whole thing with virology, is that they never actually get any virus by itself so they can examine it and figure out what it is. They only get like shadows and partial fingerprints of something unknown. Like, imagine if you were looking for a person but you didn't know who they were, right? And all you found were partial fingerprints. Well, you couldn't match those to a person because you didn't know who the person was to match it to, right? And so that's like the problem that they have. And anyone who's actually looked at the experiments, and like you said, almost all the scientists, and certainly no doctors, have looked at these experiments unless they've done it in the last year, you know, specifically for this purpose, like maybe after they heard me talk about it. But normally you wouldn't even look for these papers if you're a doctor. You would just hear from the public health agency that there's this new virus that causes a disease. But anyone I know of who's actually looked at it, actually read it, not just heard about it as a rumor or anything like that, they've all realized that the experiments that they do don't show any new viruses. They just show particles that could be a number of different things. We have no idea really what they are, for sure.
even on the very rare occasions where you have an actual scientist using an implement to go through this process, such as an electron microscope. The electron microscope does not work in the traditional sense. And we lay people think of, okay, I want to visually see this thing. But that's not the process. It's actually a blasting of light up through the sample. And if the sample is a little bit thick, you're not even getting the full visual. You're
actually, Johnny, it's much worse than that. So let me just separate out there two issues here. Like, one is, what is the material that you're looking at under the microscope in the first place? Now, if you wanted to isolate a virus, you'd have basically just the virus particles and nothing else in your sample, and you'd look at that under the microscope. And they've done that for bacteriophages, right, which are what they say are viruses that live with bacteria. They've done it for other so-called viruses that live with sea algae. And they've done it for exosomes that they pull directly out of our blood or lung fluid. So they can get a pure sample of particles this size. And they have well-established procedures to separate it from everything else. So that's one issue. They just don't do this with viruses because there are no viruses. So they can't separate it and isolate it. But they'd still take a sample from a tissue culture and put it under that microscope. And you're right. So when you talk about looking at things under a microscope, it's not like putting on a pair of eyeglasses to make your vision sharper exactly. When you look at a regular light microscope, you can look at things that way under low power, where you can take like a sample of pond water, for example, and put it in a slide and put it under the microscope, and you might see some images of little things crawling around. And those are exactly the way, those are alive. So you can observe them behave, right? You know that they look the same way that they do if you could see them, because they're moving around and they're alive. They're not transformed into something else. Like after an animal or an organism is dead, it changes, right? Like think about our bodies. When they die, they get stiff, like rigor mortis, right? So they change. But when you look at something that's still alive, you know that it's the way it is when it's alive, because it's alive when you're looking at it. And that is the best way to observe something, because not only can you see the structure, but you can also see the behavior. Now, in medicine, they never look at things that are alive. They kill everything first. So even if they use these low-powered light microscopes, they still kill the sample because they use stains. And stains make it easier to see certain structures, but they also change,
contaminate the sample,
whatever you're staining.
Right.
Because you have to dehydrate it and mix it with chemicals and salt solutions, and then with the stain. So all those things change what you're looking at. So if you want to be scientific, you always have to correlate the dead stain tissue to the living tissue to see, are those things compatible? Do they correlate? Or is something just an artifact of the process of mixing it with the chemicals and staining it?
And Dr. Kaufman, if I could step on you for just a second, we've already left the scientific method, because the scientific method says when you're going through your experiment, you're supposed to isolate the variables, not infuse new variables. As a matter of fact, this is part of the process of so-called virus isolation. And I listen to you and Dr. Cowan talk about it, and it's amazing to infuse massive amounts of genetic material to poison the sample, to starve the sample. It's not only is it astounding, it's kind of Mengele-esque.
Well, that all happens before anything goes near the microscope. And you're right, it is, because essentially what they have this theory that the virus, right, destroys cells. Okay. So what they do is they take a sample from a person that supposedly has a virus, right, from a sick person. Okay, it's never been shown or proven before, but this is how they say they prove it, right? So it's suspected of having a virus, so take your lung fluid or your snot or your tears, whatever. And then you put it in a cell culture. Now they use foreign cells generally, usually monkey kidney cells, also called Vero cells. And this is because they work for this experiment. That's the only reason they use them. Okay, it doesn't make sense because we're talking about viruses that cause disease in humans. So if anything, we should use human cells. but they know they can get the results with the monkey cells. So they use it, and then they add things specifically toxic to monkey kidneys or to kidneys, which are antibiotics. They say that it's to eliminate bacteria from contaminating the sample, but the thing is they can easily see bacteria under the microscope. So you'd be able to tell if they were contaminating the sample. You don't really need the antibiotics. And then they add other toxic things like foreign blood products, such as calf serum from a fetal calf. So they have to like abort the fetus and take the blood out of it and then separate out the serum. And they add that. And they also use what's called a minimal essential medium, which is the food that they give to the cell culture, but it's essentially a subsistence diet, like, you know, bread and water only, not a full nutritious diet. And so they're basically putting the cells under stress from all these toxic insults and starvation. And then, of course, those cells start to break down and die. And that's what you're looking at. And when cells break down and die, they break off into little particles. That's well characterized in the literature. And so they hand that messy, toxic cell culture off to the microscopist, who then, you know, processes it by heating it and bombarding it with heavy metals and electron beams, right? And then shows pictures under the electron microscope of the cells in the culture and then little particles coming off them. And those are the particles of dying cells, but they point to one and say that's a virus. And that's the proof that they give that there's a virus. That's all the proof they have.
And you type into Google and say, has the coronavirus been isolated? And you get page after page after page. Oh, of course, the coronavirus has been isolated. Let me also mention.
So the trick is in the language, though, because in the title of the paper where they do that tissue culture experiment, they call it virus isolation. So they misuse the word, right? And that's where they change the language. So they actually mean the opposite of isolation, because they join it together with many more things instead of separating from other things. But they call it that. And so you can answer that question and say, yes, it's been isolated. Look, here's 4 or 6 papers that say it's been isolated. The only thing is that those are all tissue culture experiments. They're not isolation at all. So you have to have a whole lesson on the vocabulary just to explain this to people, and not like Tom and Sally and I, we actually wrote a special page on our website. And the main motivation was so people stopped sending us articles that say it's isolated, because we've been there and done that. And so we laid out this explanation that this is a different meaning. And so you have to look at, are they doing tissue culture? And you have to look at, did they purify the virus? Because that word they haven't corrupted yet. So you can use that word still by its actual meaning.
I've seen that petition, and I recommend that everyone to visit your website, andrewkaufmanmd.com. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah,
And
fantastic. That petition is a powerful tool. I'm going to acknowledge my adopted son, Bryson, there. My child prodigy, so proud of him. I was give you a big hug. No, knock all the breath out of you, young man. So, corrupted. Let me talk about another word, compromised. As a matter of fact, title of a fantastic must-read book by Terry Kent Reed, Compromised. Terry Reed's Air Force pilot and intelligence analyst in Vietnam. He was compromised in Vietnam, and I'm aware of the process that is used in the military. And I'll bet you that it's a very similar process in turning a healer into a doctor, of getting them to walk down this road. And Terry Kent Reed, fantastic book and very eye-opening in relation to drug smuggling in the CIA. And he says, when he was an intelligence analyst for the Air Force during the Vietnam War, that as he was analyzing bomb damage assessments information after action reviews on missions, they were realizing that the North Vietnamese were putting prisoner of war camps along their logistic lines. and they were plotting missions along those lines, regardless of the casualties of the American and Allied casualties. And when he brought this up to he was an enlisted man, brought this up to the officer said, do your job or we'll send you home and we'll get somebody else who will do it for you. And he said he went back to his seat and did his job, and he was sick about it and he lost sleep about it and he never forgot it. And that's probably the impetus for how it is that he wrote this book of basically being a whistleblower of this slippery slope of compromise. So I guess my question to you, Dr. Andrew Kaufman, is what's wrong with you? How did you pop out of this process? What was it that said, you said, I can't do this?
Well, it's a good question and it's kind of difficult to answer. I'm a little bit stubborn sometimes about things, but I think what I really discovered about myself is that my main motivating source is justice. And that when I perceive an injustice in the world, and the bigger it is, the more I react to it, that I just cannot go against the resolution of that. Like I need to bring about some sort of equity and justice to the situation in as much as I can. And it really drives me. And I don't feel right going against it. So, I went through a slow process of sort of coming out of main Western allopathic medicine after realizing that it's not helping people and in fact, mostly hurting people. And once I learned each piece of information during my path through that journey, I then couldn't do certain things anymore that were part of my job. And for the past several years, really all I did was take teenage patients off medications. I just could not write to start them on something. It was like, it was a physical impossibility, like my body wouldn't do it. You know what I mean? So it's been like that for me. And once I found out the truth about this, I just, unless someone provides me evidence, and by the way, I'm more than willing to look at new scientific evidence that may support something that I don't, agree with. But once I find something out and I'm pretty sure that I've exhausted the evidence out there and reached a solid conclusion, I can't revert from that. I have to basically change whatever's going on in my life to try and embody that new truth and move forward. And, I believe that's the only way to go.
The success of turning healers into compromised doctors is shocking. Is absolutely shocking. And the average person on the street has no idea. They trust doctors, they trust politicians, they trust experts, they trust scientists. They have no idea. And when I try to paint that picture, I found it difficult until I came across an example that I heard from Dr. Andrew Kaufman. And Dr. Andrew Kaufman says, as far as the power of corruption, all you have to do is look at the field of oncology. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Oncology is kind of a unique area of medicine. And I think, by the way, a lot of what we're talking about really has to do with the business model. If you truly want to change what you do with respect to these things, you have to change your business model. So oncology has a unique business model in medicine because normally you have to provide the services to generate revenue. And in fact, someone who is an oncologist once suggested at a meeting that really true wealth is when other people generate your revenue for you. And you can do that in oncology. And the way that happens is that you evaluate a patient and then you prescribe a course of chemotherapy. And then what happens is different than in other areas of medicine because they don't go to the pharmacy and get a prescription for the chemo. Sometimes they might go to the hospital to get the chemo, but any businessman oncologist would have their own chemo suite. So basically in their office, they have a number of chairs. And what they do is they make money from that initial valuation where they actually have to be with the patient. But then after that, they get paid twice to give that chemo. One is that they sell the chemo drug to the patient. Okay, so the drug companies actually sell it to them and give them a discount if they'll, favor their chemo versus their competitors. They sell that, make profit off that, and then they also get a fee for administering the chemo, which their nurse does. Their nurse has to mix it and then, run the IV. And they could be on the golf course while this is happening. So in other words, if they keep those chemo chairs as full as possible, their money's coming in around the clock, no matter what they're doing. They could be taking meetings, doing leisurely activities, whatever. So kind of, a true wealth situation. So this is a massive financial incentive to give as much chemo as possible. And of course, if you look at how oncologists really feel about chemo when they're surveyed, and there's a published research on this, would you give chemo to your family or would you take it? Something like over 90% of them say that they wouldn't, right? So they, on the one hand, know it's bad stuff. On the other hand, they're making money hand over fist from it.
That's not surprising, Dr. Kaufman, because another statistic I've seen is that if you are diagnosed with cancer and you put yourself in the hands of doctors, you have a 97% chance of not overcoming the cancer and dying from it. And chemotherapy is amazing in that not only does it give you a 3% chance of surviving your own cancer, and if you are in that 3%, the chances are probably pretty good that your body is so resilient, you're overcoming both the chemotherapy and the cancer, that the cancer is not actually helping you. It's just that somehow by divine interaction, you're actually overcoming both the cause and the cure. And it's not particularly cheap either as well, is it? So, and this reminds me of something else that originally the drug AZT, which was used to help so-called HIV and AIDS patients, was a form of chemotherapy, and the Food and Drug Administration struck it down because it was look, as toxic chemotherapy. You take chemotherapy to help you with cancer, and actually it's likely to give you a new cancer. AZT was even worse than that. And so it was taken down in relation to use and then brought back so that we could help AIDS, HIV patients. And the name that cropped up in this process, Dr. Kaufman, is Anthony Fauci for some reason. Interesting.
Well, the whole AIDS pandemic was really in many ways a dress rehearsal for the current situation. And AZT is not the only drug to be taken off the shelf that was too toxic in the past. So you're right, AZT was originally developed as a chemotherapy agent because it is a toxic drug, and it was considered too poisonous. And then it was re-released in the AIDS era and really fraudulently approved for that condition. There was a lot of corruption in those trials at the time. And essentially what most likely happened is that drug gave a lot of people AIDS, and or if they had AIDS, it made them much worse and they died. And in fact, even on the package insert for that drug, it says that it causes AIDS. The other example I was thinking of is a psychiatric drug called clozapine, which is also extremely toxic and was shelved as being too dangerous, and then somehow in the 90s came back and is prescribed for schizophrenia. And it's so dangerous that you have to monitor it with weekly blood tests, and many patients have just dropped dead from it or had all kinds of weird toxic complications.
So a couple of things. I want to go a little bit further on HIV and AIDS, but a little while earlier on in the interview, you said something that should have been shocking, and I guess I'm just too used to it. No such thing as a virus. No such thing as a virus. That's just crazy talk right there. You need to explain yourself, Dr. Kaufman.
Well, a while ago, more than 100 years, there was this theory that in some cases of disease, they were unable to see microorganisms like bacteria, and that there was some invisible agent that caused the disease. And they termed this a virus. And originally, it was thought to be a poison, a substance, not a organism or a particle. And when the electron microscope was invented in the early 1930s, scientists started to look. So they took tissue from people with diseases that they thought had some kind of virus associated with it. And they were unable to differentiate any viral particles or viruses from the normal breakdown products of cells. And this basically was about the end of the field until it got a resurgence in the 50s. And at that time, there were a number of factors. There was a scientist who was working on developing polio vaccines, John Enders, he got a Nobel Prize. There was also the recent discovery about the double helix of DNA. And so there was this kind of new theory that maybe this virus was something that contained genetic material, which was a new concept. And then the same kind of tissue culture experiments that the scientists said, we can't tell if any of these particles are a virus, suddenly was reinterpreted. And this slightly different procedure was developed using the monkey kidney cells by John Enders, which made it much easier to repeat these experiments. And then that was put forth as proof of a virus. And that's the experiment that has been done to prove every single virus that causes disease. And so without even getting into any experiments that would be conducted to show causation, they've never actually truly isolated, by the common definition of the word, one virus that is alleged to cause disease in humans. Now, for some of these diseases, there are clearly defined alternative causes, but for most of them, we simply don't really know the true cause of these illnesses.
Yeah, John Enders, Yale Scroll and Key, where he learned to keep secrets, Delta, Kappa, Epsilon, and an integral part of the polio fraud. So that's another difficult question, and there's just so much. I wish I could keep you for hours. There's just so much to talk about, from AIDS to polio. I have a young man, as a matter of fact, that I just recently gave up on because he's awake, as we say, and yet he is aware of this so-called dichotomy between what is called terrain theory, and it's actually just simply real healthcare, versus germ theory. And he says he is absolutely wedded to germ theory because he works on his family's farm. And when his livestock gets sick, he administers an antibiotic and the animal gets better. And so as far as he's concerned, that proves so-called germ theory. I was speaking to your assistant, Jonathan, about this, and I remembered, I'm so proud of myself because I threw this query at him at the time, and Jonathan was also quick and caught this and said, well, pause, back up. How did your livestock get sick in the first place? What are they eating? Where are they living? How are they able to rest in the cycle that they should be resting? Or are they stressed? Are you keeping them in tiny pens? Are you prodding them and poking them and torturing them? So I didn't say torturing them, but
well, Johnny, I think you now those are excellent questions to answer if you want to determine what the cause of them getting ill. But let's just talk about this, evidence given, because a lot of people make this mistake. They say, okay, people are dying. That's evidence that there's a virus, right? Or in this case, he's saying, well, they give antibiotics, so that's evidence that a bacteria caused the disease. So let's just take something unrelated to illness, like a fire. So now we know if we put water on a fire, it puts the fire out, right? So now, is the cause of a fire a lack of water? No, right? Things that are dry don't spontaneously burst into flames, right? There has to be something to ignite it. That's the cause of the fire. So it's the same thing here with the farm animals, that, okay, maybe antibiotics do resolve the symptoms, but does that mean that the bacteria caused the infection or the disease? No.
Can I underline, highlight what you said? the antibiotic may have mitigated the symptom. Oh, that's so important.
Right? It put out the fire, so to speak. But it didn't
Excellent.
address the cause.
Excuse me, doctor.
Yes.
Go ahead, George. George, go ahead. We love George. George is our mascot. George, you have the floor. Go.
Hello, Dr. King.
Yeah, you've got a bad connection, pal. You're in and out. Can you try and get it out?
Sorry. So, doctor, I had a couple of questions, and you've already alluded to some of these earlier in the interview. First, can you just give us a quick definition of germ versus terrain theory and why the difference is so important?
Yeah, sure. They're really kind of the opposite of each other. Germ theory says that, you know, a microscopic organism like a bacteria or fungus or an alleged virus, you know, enters the body, invades it somehow from the environment, and then causes disease, and that you can't really control it. The terrain theory says that microorganisms are present ubiquitously. In fact, 99% of us are microorganisms, and that those have a role of what's called as saprophytes in nature, which means that they break down dead and dying organic matter, right? Just like you would see in the woods, if there was a pile of leaves on the ground, you'd see it decompose over time into humus, which is a process that the microorganisms in the forest floor undergo to break down the leaves, which are dead organic debris. And they do the same thing in your body. So in the example that Johnny mentioned with the farm animal getting an infection, what's happening is that there's something that's damaging the tissue in that animal, and it most likely could be toxins, perhaps from GMO food or another source. And that damages the tissue, and then the bacteria actually, which are already in your body and in your own cells, respond to the site of the tissue damage, and they clean it up. And the cleanup process involves inflammation, because inflammation increases the blood flow to that area, which allows more nutrients to be brought to like rebuild the damaged areas, and also allows the waste materials to be taken away. But that inflammation results in the swelling because there's more fluid in the tissue, and that puts pressure on the nerves and can cause discomfort. And it also causes secretions like the stuff that we cough up or sneeze, or even diarrhea if the disease involved the colon. And that's the way that our body can purge the debris and the toxic waste products from the area that was damaged.
Doctor, do you subscribe to the 7 stages of disease?
I'm not sure what those are.
Oh, well, excellent. Good.
I know the 7 stages of grief.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about the 7 deadly sins.
Yeah. So the 7 stages of disease: stage 1, enervation, which is a loss of energy; stage 2, toxemia or toxosis; stage 3, irritation; stage 4, inflammation; stage 5, ulceration, and the process where the body's trying to get rid of toxins through the skin and opens up larger than the pores. Stage 6 is induration, scarring, and stage 7 is chaotic cell growth, aka cancer.
So no, I'm not familiar with that exact formulation, but certainly I'm familiar with all the concepts in there.
Okay, I just it's been very helpful to me, but I'm also new to it. So
well, I think it's really is compatible with terrain theory.
I think so too. I want to back up real quick. George, we took care of you for a second. Can I jump in, step on you, pal?
Yes, and I do have a follow-up for the doctor when you're done.
All right, go ahead and give your follow-up, pal. Now that we got you clearly.
Now, doctor, I'm just wondering, now, it seems as if that, now, to be honest with you, prior to last year, I had never heard of terrain theory. I had heard of germ theory because that's the dominant view. And 2 years ago, way back in 2019, this is something that would have been considered purely academic, something you might get together with a couple of friends over for a drink or a cup of coffee or whatever, and say, well, that's an interesting idea, but I think I'm going to go with germ theory, where now germ theory has become not only the dominant orthodox view, as a corollary, terrain is now the heterodox view. You're a heretic if you subscribe to that. More to the point, you're a quack, you're a charlatan, you're superstitious, you're anti-science, you're an obscurantionist. What do you mean? Nobody holds to terrain theory. I mean, maybe 100 years ago, but nobody today. I mean, you would certainly never be admitted into a mainstream medical school, and you certainly never would be granted a medical license, or you could have a practice. It's just like, boy, that's almost in the same league as, flat Earth. So how would you respond to that?
Well, what I've done is actually decided to relinquish my medical license and get rid of practicing that model of medicine because it's not effective. And, terrain theory may be heretical in many ways. And I know that a lot of people might call me a quack because, say that I'm a virus denier and other things like that. But and of course, there isn't a large body of scientific evidence to explain every aspect of terrain theory because it hasn't really been an effort to investigate it. But actually, in a way, there has, and people have already accepted it. They just don't know it by that name. And what I'm talking about is the microbiome or the gut microbes. Right now, you have all the time people, on the one hand, they'll be taking antibiotics, but on the other hand, they'll be sneaking to the health food store and getting probiotics because they realize that antibiotics will cause this damage and that probiotics are good, but they don't fully understand why. But really, the whole idea behind, eating fermented foods, taking probiotic supplements, is all based on terrain theory. So I look at my role as to try and expand the education to the public to help them realize that they already actually know about this and they've already embraced it as being important for their health. They just have to think it fully through and understand the full corollaries of and the conclusions that you would arrive based on the inevitability of this information.
George, excellent question. I really wanted to go big picture with Dr. Kaufman, and I appreciate you doing that for us. Dr. Kaufman, you were in a roundtable discussion that I felt you knocked out of the park, and instead, the host cut your feed because you were making too good of a point with Dr. Judy Mikovits. And this went to the root of whether or not it's possible to isolate any virus. And Dr. Mikovits contends that she has personally isolated HIV, whereas there are other authorities that say that the human immunodeficiency virus doesn't even exist. I've seen some work by a researcher, a nutritionist, an author by the name of Gary Null on relation to what HIV/AIDS actually was, particularly back in the 80s, and having originated from New York City and San Francisco and not Africa, as we were told, African natives having sex with monkeys or some perverse, devious, ridiculous, ludicrous idea. And
it's like bats at a food market.
Right. So, we always have this issue of this crossing over of pathogens from animal to human, and it never really makes any sense. And it's pretty darn impossible until you get involved with a hypodermic, but that's besides the point.
Well, it fits with the agenda of the Codex Alimentarius, which is to prevent people from being able to grow their own food. So the bird flu, for example, right, recently they've had to kill chickens, they've killed mink related to this, fake virus. So I think the reason they use these so-called animal vectors is to justify that animals are not safe and we're not allowed to domesticate animals for food.
That is brilliant. Brilliant.
But Doctor, even though we've been doing this for thousands of years.
Right. Yeah, that's why you need some kind of fakery to convince people that it's not safe.
Oh my goodness.
Because history would tell us that it's actually the way we survive.
God bless your cynicism. What a brilliant point. That it's all part of the fear mongering to keep people from doing their own husbandry. Well, anyway, so from what from Gary Null's research is that this was part of a toxification within a subculture of homosexuals in metro environments that were going full weekends of no sleep and free and irresponsible sexual interactions, strong with alcohol, tobacco, cocaine, and then they would attempt to mitigate the possibility of diseases by taking injections of penicillin, also taking
Amyl nitrate.
oh yes, the huffing of the amyl nitrate was a huge factor, and also an experimental hepatitis B vaccine as well. And surprise, surprise, they had a so-called suppressed immune system. And I love Dr. Cowan on that, constantly correcting people. No such thing as an immune system. It's a health system. And out of the park. So the response, it seemed like there was an opportunity to capitalize off of. And this is part of that slippery slope of compromise. No one cares about intravenous drug users. No one cares about homosexuals. So let's use them and compromise the industry and basically just kill them off and make a ton of money in the process.
Well, there was definitely, and I think it's important to talk about, the virus HIV, which also doesn't exist, and AIDS separately. We're talking about here AIDS, the illness. And I don't want to give the impression that the illness was not real, because people were ill in different places. And actually, in different geographic areas, you had a different explanation for the so-called immunosuppressive illness. So what you're talking about is really in the big urban centers in the United States, like San Francisco, where you had largely a homosexual population that had a very, very unhealthy lifestyle, and a small subset of homosexuals. This is definitely not generalized to all homosexuals, but there was a community in San Francisco that were having, just incredible numbers of sexual partners and having to use drugs to basically have the sexual performance to even do that. And it was interesting because it was right after this new transplant rejection medicine came out called azathioprine. And the first kidney transplant recipients who were given that drug to prevent rejection actually developed Kaposi's sarcoma and pneumocystis PCP pneumonia, which were the two first most popular reported AIDS-defining illnesses. So the drugs that they were using that you mentioned, one for prevention of sexually transmitted diseases, an antibiotic called Bactrim, in addition to penicillin, and also the skin poppers, amyl nitrate, were chemically related to azathioprine and brought about similar kind of immunosuppressive or energy suppressive effects. And these contributed to the lifestyle, the sleep deprivation, the recreational drug use, the incredible amount of sexual partners, to create this condition in some of those people. Now, in an area like South Africa, it was very different. There you had minors who were sick with lung disease, and they basically there had a different explanation. They said it was because of the prostitutes on the trade routes, and the truckers were spreading it and bringing it in. And what happened was, instead of those companies paying disability claims for their injured workers, they were diagnosed with AIDS, and then it was blamed on sexual transmission, and the companies were off the hook. So Nancy Turner Banks has done an excellent job writing about this in her book, AIDS, Opium, Diamonds, and Empire. I would encourage people to look at it. But essentially what we're describing here is that marginalized populations were exploited for various reasons: for profit, to avoid responsibility and liability, to market and develop new drugs and tests. And they used marginalized populations because, the general population wouldn't care too much if they were affected. But I do want to give credit to the homosexual community in the United States, because that was, the era that I worked for the health department, and they did really band together and change, at least temporarily, these lifestyle practices to restore health to the community overall.
Well, and I would say that there are several parts, and really, this is so true in any so-called community. I believe that Black Lives Matter is totally co-opted. That leadership are machine is machine infiltrated leadership. I saw an ACT UP article, ACT UP, the organization that says to homosexuals, hey, stick out as much as possible, make as much of a nuisance of yourself as possible, and pardon my language, piss people off with your behavior and your lifestyle to make sure that people are angry with you. ACT UP attacking Gary Null for his report on this. So I would say probably the same is true for major so-called homosexual organizations as ACT UP that are actually working on behalf of the machine.
Well, absolutely. You know, any organization gets subverted over time and acts to basically with the main goal of self-preservation. And, you know, the culture in the homosexual community changed to be where you basically weren't accepted unless you were HIV positive. And I've even heard of people taking antiviral medications when they even had a negative test because they wanted to, you know, be part of that. It was like became part of the identity. And so, you know, that is not what I'm talking about at all. I'm talking about the initial efforts where you saw a community really band together and come together to try to solve their own problems. And that's a model that we should all do for all the problems. And I feel like, you know, that's what we're doing, coming together here today to get some of this truth out in the open and put our heads together so that we can start thinking about, you know, how do we deal with this situation for ourselves and our families.
Amen. And Vinny, you have something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I've been dying to talk to Hugh Kaufman for a while. I'm pretty excited. I want to thank you for coming on. I'm the one who tried to get this set up and was a little rude to your partner, Jacqueline.
It went well, pal. Go ahead.
But it's because to me, like Johnny was saying, I think a lot of us didn't get into germ theory and all this until COVID. And, you know, to me, you are like a hero, like he's saying, you're like the leading face. So to me, the past year, this is the most important topic and you're like the guy leading the way. So I know you don't have a lot of time and I've been dying to. So I guess I got one question that I really want to ask is Dr. Zebi. I ask this to any doctor and people I talk to. Do you know about Dr. Zebi and do you have any comments about Dr. Zebi?
So I definitely do know of Dr. Sebi, and unfortunately, he's not around with us because I would have really loved to, you know, had a relationship and learn more from him. And I know that he had quite a bit of success in his main, you know, paradigm or model that he was treating people had to do with increasing the alkalinity of their body, that a highly acidic body, and especially the blood, I think is what he was really talking about, is associated or causative of disease. And by changing your nutrition and using herbs that would increase the alkalinity of your body, that you can cure much disease. And yeah, I know that he had
said that there is no disease except for mucus, right?
Yes.
He's saying that there's no disease except for mucus. And he won that court case in New York where they were saying he was doing fake medicine and he was curing all these people. And he proved it too, where he said that it's herbs that cure people. That's how it was from the beginning. It's not chemicals, it's herbs. And he seems like, you know, maybe he was onto something. And I've been trying to ask people what their thoughts are.
Yeah, well, he definitely was onto something. And, you know, what I've learned since I've studied natural healing is firstly, that I certainly don't know everything about it or even close to it. But what I have found is that there are many different ways using purely natural things. I'm talking about not anything made in a laboratory or in a manufacturing plant, but using natural substances and you know, mechanisms that you can bring about healing of almost any condition. And there are different theoretical formulations, right? Like we have Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, naturopathic, herbal. You have Dr. Sebi, you know, Dr. Jennifer Daniels, you have Vonderplanets, you have so many different, you have German new medicine. right? And all of these different modalities have successes, some of them more than others. And what I think the takeaway is that nature has built in all of the things that we need to deal with any situation with our bodies. And that not only that, but nature has built redundancy in all of these ways of restoring our body to the pure state of health that we want to be in. And so that if you're in one geographic area, certain plants grow there that will provide those healing properties, totally distinct from if you live in a very different geographic area. And that's why we have discovered these sort of different substances and different methods. But I think if we probably all got together and were able to conduct enough research to figure out how all these things work, that we'd probably find that they are just a couple of principles that they all work on. And you might talk about it as reducing mucus, or you might talk about it as detoxifying, but it's probably the same exact thing, because the mucus is trying to get the toxins out, and that's why it's created, and different ways to address it that'll all be successful.
Okay. Doc, Bryson, you guys have anything? Hang on. Dr. Kaufman, how long do I have you for? Do you need to go?
Yeah, it's about time. I can take like one more question
Okay.
if you like.
All right, Bryson, Doc. Nothing, Bryson?
I don't got anything, but it is a pleasure to meet you, Dr. Kaufman. I've been watching your stuff for some time now, and never thought I would have the opportunity to take part in the conversation with you. So, pleasure to meet you.
Well,
Yeah.
same here. And
Yes.
thanks all you guys for participating. I really appreciate it, and especially, you know, the enthusiasm from the younger folks. I don't get to interact with people of your age too often, so I definitely appreciate it.
He's a revolutionary. Doc Felipe, do you have anything for Doc Kaufman?
I think I'm same. Just glad to be part of this, and then just soak it all in, and all the information was really very interesting. Yeah, very great interview.
Dr. Kaufman, I wish I had you for another. Go ahead, George. We got to close out, pal.
Okay, Doc, can I ask you one question?
Quickly.
Okay, well, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. Okay, quick question. Here in California, we have 58 counties, and each county has a health director and a health officer. And it turns out that almost all of whom have some sort of nexus with the CDC, the World Health Organization, or both. As a matter of fact, our local health officer worked for both the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control. Now, she was hired in March of last year. This was our Board of Supervisors hired her. So this is not an elected position. Almost immediately, she imposed all these tyrannical and draconian policies. Within a month, she issued the mask mandate. As a matter of fact, our jurisdiction, Sonoma County, California, was the first one in the country to issue such an edict. So let me just ask you something. Whenever I've had a doctor who's had prescribed some sort of medical intervention, he's always done at least some sort of cursory examination. For example, he's used a stethoscope. He's asked me some questions. Hey, can you cough? Can you bend over? Whatever. This health officer just made a unilateral decision affecting almost 500,000 people. We have this virus, this highly contagious, highly deadly virus out there, then you all need to start wearing this mask. To me, at minimum, she sounds incompetent, because you had to go, what is to say, for argument's sake, there is a virus, and I'm saying hypothetically, there is some sort of airborne pathogen. Wouldn't you have to examine every person in the county to make such a determination?
So let me just sum it up for you, Dr. Kaufman. So George is venting because he's in the People's Republic of California. And there are a lot of people, millions upon millions of people, that are being oppressed by bureaucrats and apparatchiks claiming to be speaking on behalf of health and so-called doctors. Do you have any feedback on that?
Yeah, well, I would say, since when is it their decision? How do you take care of your health? If you think that wearing a mask is a good idea, by all means, go ahead and cover your face. But you probably, I don't really want to hang around with you if that's how you're going to feel about it. But but if you look at any of the science or just go with common sense, like we've been around viral diseases all our lives. Has anyone ever said we should wear masks? No. Well, don't you think if it was a good idea, they would have said it before? Yeah. So, why wear it? And, these puppet figureheads in public health positions, they're just told what to say. They're not thinking independently or using reason or investigation to make those decisions. They're simply handed a policy and said, this is what you do. In fact, there was a Canadian public health official, I think it was the main person for British Columbia, and they had like one of those outtakes, and she admitted, she was like, I don't know why I have these papers in front of me, these notes in front of me. I just say what they tell me to say. So, I think that's pretty much it. But if you could tell if someone is actually thinking about what they're saying and if they present a cogent argument, and that's a good way to tell who to listen to. But as far as these, tyrants thinking that they're dictators and that they can order individual people to do this or that they're wrong. They have no authority. There's no law that says that I have to obey a public health officer. So, I know that people are acting as if it is a law and if it is required, but this is the true nature of it.
Amen. Amen. Dr. Kaufman, thank you for staying along with us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and hopefully we can have you back. I know we bandied about the idea of possibly an intervention with our friends, Dr. Leonard Horowitz, in relation to HIV and AIDS and what really causes, what is AIDS and what really causes AIDS, and we'll work on that for you. Look, the fact that you came on with us just this one time is just absolutely phenomenal. We're so grateful to you for it, and maybe we can squeeze you in again in the near future. But in the meantime, people that love you and love your work, where can they go? How can they do that? How can they support you?
Yeah, well, please go to my website at andrewkaufmanmd.com, 1F, 1N, and MD like medical doctor. And first sign up for my newsletter, because then you'll be in the loop about everything. But I have a new live webinar series with great guests, and you get to ask me questions live every other Tuesday. And then I sell a wonderful Shilajit. It's a pure Rocky Mountain derived trace mineral supplement.
Excellent. Dr. Kaufman, again, thank you so much. And please continue to have the courage to do what you're doing, because you are leading a revolution and we need it desperately.
Thank you so much, Johnny.
All right, guys, take care. Thanks to all of my flying monkeys and my beloved team here. And you'll see us again further on in the week.
Gotcha. Have a good one, everyone. Have a good one, Dr. Kaufman.
Well, take care, Doctor. Take care, Doc. Take care, Johnny. Take care, Eddie, and take care, Bryson.
Good night, John Boy. Take care. Thanks, Doctor.